Well, good evening. My name is Karen Varanch, and I don't have a microphone, so that's why I gave you the evil one I just said. So, right. I'm delighted you're here tonight. We're going to talk about a little bit of West Virginia history, Appalachian history, and Revolutionary War and the Civil War up to that point in West Virginia. You know, America has so many iconic stories. For example, the Wild West, right? When we think of that, we think of certain things. When you think of the Wild West, what do you think of?
Cowboys and Indians.
Right. So think of it this way. West Virginia was America's first Wild West. The lawlessness, the violence, the need to protect yourself, the no sheriff around but your own rifle kind of thing, the Native Americans. So with the exception of cowboys and ranches, I guess, you know, we were the first Wild West. We were the frontier. And that iconic idea that America has is there's always this frontier, this way to look forward, the way to move forward. But that frontier is a little bit out of the realm of society. It's wild, it's untamed, it's violent in some cases. It's you have to make your own way. That was West Virginia in the early days. So what was West Virginia? Was it West Virginia then? Was that Eastern Virginia, Western Virginia, I should say. So I want to read something here, and I love this quote. This is from a woman in Caney Creek, Kentucky. Verna Mae Sloan's her name. I believe God sent his strongest people to Appalachia. I think if one could take 100 men and women, such as those who've written so many articles and stories about a people and place about which they knew so little, and place those people here, and have them live the way our folk did, before 1 year was up, 99 would starve to death and the other one would go crazy.
You're right.
I think it's true. People, you had to be strong, and you had to be brave, and you had to put up with difficulties that we couldn't imagine today. I mean, the first people here, of course, were the Native Americans. There were mound builders all through what is now West Virginia, and that gave way to the period we call the Fort Ancient period, where they actually stopped building mounds and began building underground, almost built in the ground homes. When the white settlers came, most of those Indians disappeared. I will say 90% of the Indians on the East Coast died from the diseases that were brought from white settlers. Colds. They had no immunity to a cold. And so we lost 90% of those Indians. By the time settlers are coming into Western Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, we do have the tribes. We have the Cherokee in the south, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, and the Delaware in the north. Now they were fierce enemies. They did not. The Shawnee, Iroquois, and Delaware are part of the Seven Nations tribes. They tolerated each other, but they were enemies to the Cherokee. So there was already a little bit of violence, a little bit of fighting when the settlers came. And then the other problem is the settlers come and they don't know the way things are done here. They don't think the Indians actually. West Virginia, for the most part, is transient country. They come and live in the summer. They go back to the winters, other places. They don't see someone living here full time. They think, oh, no one living here. But to the natives, this was their sacred ground. And so suddenly you find a person putting up a fence and, building buildings and they don't understand, the white folks didn't understand why the natives found that so offensive. Other little things like the north-south paths, the Seneca Trail, for example, Route 219, those were paths of peace. And the east-west paths were paths of war. Well, the white settlers didn't know this. They'd come in and they'd be going on the north-south path. They'd pass some natives and go, okay, and then they'd make a right-hand turn and they'd be attacked. They wouldn't know that the paradigms or the cultural ways of doing things of the natives. And so there was lots of fighting and infighting, of course. Now, many of the first settlers, we often hear the phrase Scots-Irish. Have you heard this? How many think of themselves as being Scots-Irish? And I just want to clarify. Scotch is what we drink. Scots is who we are. It's not Scotch-Irish. That's a drink, okay? Scots-Irish. It's one of my soapboxes. And let me tell you who the Scots-Irish were. We think of them as being the defining people of West Virginia, but actually we think now they were only about 25% of the settlers. They were the largest number of settlers, though. In 1603, when James became King of England after Queen Elizabeth I dies, he wants to subdue the Irish. So he takes a bunch of Scots come on in, we've got some chairs over here. He takes a bunch of Glaswegians from Glasgow, from the lowlands of Scotland, And he takes them and plants them, that's where the plantation comes from, plants them in Northern Ireland. He said, we're going to make the Irish be Protestant. Well, how did that work out for him? Not very well. It didn't work. It's not working today. It was about 100 years of these Scottish people living in Ireland fighting with the Irish. And finally, by the late 1700s, things are bad. There's a little bit of recession. There's not work to be had. And those are the people that then come to America. So while they've lived for several generations in Ireland, they are Scottish. Okay, so we talk about being Scots-Irish, but they're much more Scottish than they are Irish. Although, certainly a Scotsman meets an Irish girl and marries, and they have a family, and suddenly you've got some Irish blood in there. And so they are Scots and Irish together. So they come to America. They're sold swampland in Pennsylvania, and they come to finally they make their way to the mountains where they can have land without having to pay for it. And that's that Appalachian spirit. By God, I was kicked out of Scotland. I was kicked out of Ireland. I was kicked out of Pennsylvania. I'm not leaving here. That's that West Virginia, that Appalachian spirit, that strength of spirit. But they were not the only ones who came. We had lots and lots of black slaves that escaped from the South. We had people who were conscripted on boats in England and came over across the ocean and in Europe and then said, I'm not going back on that ship, and we escaped to the mountains. Portuguese and Welsh and Spanish and French. So there were all different kinds of groups that came. As evidenced by this one, have you ever heard of what a Melungeon is?
Yeah.
You ever heard of Melungeons? Okay. Melungeons were a race of people that were living here when white settlers arrived. They aren't black. They aren't white. They aren't native. They're all of those things. And they were an amalgamation of all the people who found the mountains a place to escape to, and created this so almost a race of people, a culture of people that were all these things put together. In fact, we know there's Portuguese in them because in the 1970s, a Melungeon man famously had a nervous disease the doctors identified as being a Portuguese-only disease. So we know there's Portuguese, we know there's Welsh, we know there's all these things. Some of the most famous Melungeons are, anybody know? Elvis Presley, Abraham Lincoln, Ava Gardner, Cher. So, these were people, and they are characterized by very black hair, blue eyes, very long waists, which is a typical Welsh tradition. And so there are people that, there are probably today more Melungeons in North Carolina than there are anymore in West Virginia. But at any rate, my point of this rambling is that many people came here to create this mountain, not just the Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish were probably the largest group by themselves, but still we had, and then in 1830, when the Trail of Tears took all the Cherokee and Creek from the south, they took the Shawnee from the north too. They took the Shawnee from Ohio in this area, and many of them said, I'm not going on that, and escaped to West Virginia, to the mountains, because this is where you could hide. This is where you can be who you want to be. This is where you don't have to, where there is this lawlessness, this freedom, if you call it that, but also this ability that as long as you can take care of yourself, you can be here. So we have this really amalgamation of people that's not just a white settler, white culture, but that's a culture of people who are strong and who are independent. And that becomes the Appalachian spirit, this fiercely independent, fairly fatalistic religiously, because a lot of them brought their Bibles with them, and you don't have a preacher, so all you have is that Bible. So you have this is what the Bible said, and this real sense of strong women, fierce people, independent lives. So that's where the Appalachian spirit, I think, comes from. That's where we define this Appalachian spirit. But as I said, it was always sort of a violent place. This place that early on, the French and the English were fighting over who would own this land. I've got a little bit here. Hold on. The British had 500,000 settlers all through, at Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, whatever. The French had 60. The French wanted to control the land, and so who did they enlist but the Native Americans? The Native Americans appreciated the French more. The French wanted to trap beavers and send them back to France. The English wanted to own land. So the Native Americans sided with the French during the French and Indian War. And that was one of the hallmarks of that war was the Battle of Monongahela up by Morgantown, what is now Morgantown. General Braddock marched in 10,000 troops, and he was killed by the French and Indians. And his lieutenant, a young feller by the name of George Washington, lost the battle. I mean, if we could, and this is another whole different speech, we could go back, all the people who were great in this world, who started out with defeat early in their life. So Washington took his troops back east to defeat, and the Native Americans went on the warpath. And they went all through the mountains. And of course, that's where Mary Draper Ingalls was captured. And you know that, I'm not going to go into that story today because we've got too much else to talk about. But the French and Indian War was a defining factor, was pretty early on, the British win. And that, again, helps to subject the Indians. So, but then comes, we're headed toward, America is still a subject of England, and they're starting to be dissatisfied because they're here and they're not having any say in what their taxes are about. You know, taxation without representation. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, right? It's not so much they're saying don't tax me, they're saying let me help decide what's taxed, how much tax. Let me have a say in how I'm governed. That's what the Americans were fighting. I want to, when we get down and we got to the American Revolution, I want to bring up one point. The American Revolution was America's first civil war. Half of it was Americans born fighting Americans. Half of the people didn't want to split from England. They just wanted fair representation on what taxes were paid. The other half, and a much smaller half, were saying, let's create our own country. Let's get away from England. And a good number of them say, no, we need England's defensive resources. We need their military. No, we don't want to do that. The war really becomes a civil war in America. You don't think of it. You think of, when we think of the Civil War, we think of North and South, right? But that's what the American Revolution was as well. Now, I don't know if you've studied American history, but throughout time, the first battle, the first shot heard around the world was at Concord in 1775 on the bridge, right? The shot heard around the world. 6 months before that, there was a battle in West Virginia that defines the American Revolution. It's called the Battle of Point Pleasant. Have you heard of that? Okay, so let me just tell you about that. At one point, Lord Dunmore, who is the governor based out of Pittsburgh, Fort Pitt at that time, is beginning to realize that the Western settlers especially are getting pretty uppity. They aren't thinking of themselves as being English anymore. They aren't supporting King George. People in the cities are still going, I want my tea. I want my, my pretty frippery necklaces and stuff like that, right? I want to look like a British gentleman. But the settlers out west they want no part of it. And so Dunmore says he wants to put them in their place. And so he tells General Andrew Lewis, we're going to have a battle with the Shawnee up in Ohio. And I'll meet you, and we'll go in and we'll fight the Shawnee. So General Andrew Lewis gathers all these mountain men in Lewisburg, right? And they march up through what is now West Virginia to Point Pleasant, where they're supposed to meet Dunmore when he's coming down from Parkersburg, right? And you couldn't write this in a novel, guys. There is a note nailed to a tree, literally. Dunmore says, you guys go on ahead, we'll be right behind you. I mean, like, really, you couldn't put this in a Danielle Steele novel. And General Lewis goes, I'm not going to fight the Shawnee with half an army. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to stay put till Dunmore gets here. And so he hunkers in to this little jut of land where the Kanawha comes into the Ohio, and Point Pleasant is now. And is going to wait for Dunmore. On October 10th, the morning of October 10th, 1774, two men went out hunting for food to feed this army of 1,000 men that are there, 1,200 men. And there's this dense fog. It's real foggy because it's October 10th. And all of a sudden the fog lifts, and these two men see this vast army of Native Americans dressed for war standing there in the trees. And they start to run back to Warren. One gets killed, one makes it back, and there's a huge battle that day. The battle rages all day long. Nobody really clearly wins the battle, but the Native Americans retreat at the end of the day because, again, that's their normal way of working. They don't siege. As the white culture, if you fight and you don't win, you stay until you win. The Native Americans would fight for the day, go home and regroup, and come back. That was their way of doing it. So they didn't lose the battle, but they did retreat. However, as the story goes, Cornstalk, who was the chief of the Indians, would not turn his back on the enemy and rode backwards on his horse all the way back to the village. And when they got to the village, the other Indians said, okay, we're going to come back tomorrow, and we're going to fight. And Cornstalk said, okay, we will. First, we're going to kill all of our women and children, and then we'll go fight, because we cannot fight the firepower. There's no way we can win. We'll just fight to the death and all die. And the guys go, okay, we'll do it. We'll sign a treaty, I guess. And so Cornstalk got the Shawnees to sign a treaty with Dunmore. But Dunmore was furious. He wanted Andrew Lewis troops to go into Ohio, to be soundly defeated, to the English ride up to their rescue, and have them be forever grateful for the English who saved their lives and be indebted to them. That's not what happened, of course, and he's furious. So he writes out a piece of paper. He wants every man there to sign it. It says that they are subjects of King George. They signed it, and they had a postscript. Yes, we are subjects of King George, but we are Americans first. It's the first time ever the word American is used in an official document. Ever. The concept of being an American is just starting. And so it starts because of the Appalachians. I mean, would that have happened in the rest of the nation? I don't know. But this concept of who we are as a nation begins that early. There's a little postscript there as well, too. After the American Revolution actually starts, Cornstalk sees that his men are unsettled and they're going to join the British. And he thinks, I've signed a treaty, I've given my word, I'm going to go ahead. And he shows up at Point Pleasant, Fort Randolph, to tell them, and they capture him and 3 of his braves that came with him. And then unfortunately, a white man is killed, they don't know by who, but they mercilessly kill Cornstalk and his 3 braves. And the sad thing of that is, Native Americans probably would have joined with the British anyway, but they lost their voice of reason in the negotiations after the war. That was the really sad thing about Cornstalk. But anyway, Battle of Point Pleasant. How can that be the first battle of the American Revolution? It was settlers fighting Indians. How can that be the first battle of the American Revolution? Because 6 months before that, in England, in Parliament, in April, Lord North, one of the peers of Parliament, stood up and had information with his friend Dunmore and said that the settlers are getting uppity. Especially the settlers on the western frontier, we need to teach them. And they passed a law to give guns to the Shawnee to fight the settlers. So while they were not fighting English, they were fighting the Shawnee armed by the English to subdue them. Right? So that's why that becomes, to me, the first battle of the American Revolution. Actually, in 1908, there was an act of Congress, of the Senate, passed an act saying that the Battle of Point Pleasant was the first battle of the American Revolution. It didn't pass in the House, so it didn't become a law. But there is a statute today in Point Pleasant that says the Battle of Point Pleasant is the beginning of the American Revolution. It happens right here in West Virginia. And then, of course, 6 months later, we hear the shot heard around the world, and the rest of the war continues. And I'll tell you, not many historians outside of Appalachia acknowledge that battle, but I think it was a really significant aspect that it took that Appalachian spirit to make that happen. It also took the Appalachian spirit to create the concept of being an American. And so the war continues. The American Revolution continues. Doesn't go well for Washington. I gotta say, early on, I mean, the British take Boston, they take New York, they take Philadelphia. I mean, they are so much better equipped. They brought in Hessian mercenary soldiers from Germany. They have better guns. They have a well-trained army. The Americans are just like farmers and silversmiths and weavers that put down their looms and their silver work to pick up a gun. I mean, there's no sense of being a trained army. Washington is working with just really difficult things. Furthermore, the way of fighting in those days, and England was considered to be the best army in the entire world, right? And the way they would fight, they would have these, bright red uniforms, something, white X here, and they'd march in 3 lines. And the first one would kneel down and shoot, and then the next one would step in front of him while he was reloading. They would kneel down and shoot, and then would keep coming forward. That was the way they fought, right? As the Indians said, those X's made a real nice target because the Indians are not that way. The Indians fought hiding behind a tree, right? But anyway, but pretty much by 1780, by 1780, Washington is about done. He's 2 weeks away from surrendering. He writes to Congress, I can't do it anymore. I have no more guns. People are deserting the army. We have no food. I mean, that winter at Valley Forge was so cold, somebody died. Washington was really, they had some success in South Carolina with the swamp guys who were such good fighters and all. But for the most part, he could not stand up to this army. And the British were really, really cruel. There was a man named Tarkington who just did a whole massacre of people in Virginia and even killed the children because, the whole sense that we just got to get rid of everybody. I mean, there was some real cruelty that went on. And Washington's about ready to give in. And but Cornwallis wants one more battle just to seal, dig in that knife, just to seal the victory. So he sends a man. There you go. What's it? Ferguson. He sends a man named Ferguson, who's a Scotsman, to lead a group into the mountains. And it eventually becomes the Battle of Kings Mountain, which is right there on the border of North Carolina, South Carolina. It's actually in South Carolina. But if you drive just past Charlotte, you see a sign for it. So it's right there at the edge. Still Appalachia. And Ferguson meets this Appalachian group there at Kings Mountain. Now, they're fairly evenly matched, about 1,000 in each group. But those mountain men, they've been fighting Native Americans for 100 years, or at least their family, their fathers and grandfathers before them. They were all Scots-Irish, or people who had escaped to the mountains. They had all lived in the mountains and been fighting what essentially is guerrilla warfare. Shoot, hide behind a tree, shoot, that's as opposed to just straight lines of people marching. And these mountain men, they're not going to play this game of marching in 3 lines. And it is a total victory for the settlers, for the Patriots. Literally, 28 of them died. 1,000 of the British died. They're less than 10% of the British came back. And those who are captive. Ferguson is killed, and it is such a huge victory. It's a turning point of the war. By the way, this battle also really reinforces one of my earlier points. Of those 2,000 people, or like 2,400, whatever, that met on that mountain, only one, Ferguson, was born in England. The rest were all American born. American fighting for freedom from England, American fighting to stay with England. It was a civil war in every real sense. Ferguson is the only native born Englishman. But it is such a decisive victory that within 1 year, October 17th, 1981, Cornwallis surrenders. Had it not been for that, those Appalachian men turned the tide, we'd be speaking with an English accent, guys. It was Appalachia that changed the whole nature of the war. And there was still, after Cornwallis surrenders, there's still some activity. There's still some battles, not too many. The famous battle up in Fort Henry, which is where Wheeling is, with Betty Zane running for gunpowder, where her family was there and she ran for gun. And we think of the Betty Zane story again. We think of this young girl saying, "I'll go get the gunpowder, Daddy," and she runs barefoot. She's actually 30 years old and is a trained doctor. So she's this young, very serious woman who says, "I can go get the gunpowder." And she runs to get the gunpowder. The Indians are so surprised to see this woman running. They don't shoot at her, and she gets the gunpowder back and they win the day. So that's actually 82. But really, after 81, there's not much happening with the war. Kings Mountain has totally turned the tide. And in 83, there is the Treaty of Paris, and we become a nation of Americans. Thanks to, I think, the Appalachian men. Thanks to the Appalachian spirit, the independence, the resistance, the ability to look at an issue and go, okay, that's not going to work. We'll do it this way instead. Isn't that Appalachian? Right? So we win that war. Now, there's actually an interesting postscript. The next real violence in the mountains is what is known as the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. So here's Washington now. He's got this new nation. He's got to figure out he's got all this debt. He fed this army for 6 years, right? He's got to pay people back for all the cows that they ate and the weavings that they had, whatever. So he's got to raise money to pay for his new government. When the government pays money, how do they pay? They pay through taxes. Now, I don't like taxes anymore. Nobody else does. But you know what? I like roads. I like libraries. I like firemen. I like armies. That's how they get paid, through taxes. I don't like taxes. I don't want to pay for a bridge to nowhere, or I don't want to pay to study the one I knew in Louisiana. But I want an army to protect me, right? I want the police force there when I need it. Taxes is what pays the bills. So Washington decides, okay, I'm going to put a tax on spirits. Now, not just beer was, beer had a real short shelf life, but whiskey, rum, vodka, the distilled spirits had pretty long shelf life. So he puts a tax on whiskey. And whiskey was the most primarily made, so it's called the Whiskey Rebellion. Who does this hurt the most but the mountain people? I go, wait a minute, I just saved the war for you, and now you're going to tax me on the thing that's giving me my livelihood? And the other problem was they weren't asked. Wasn't this war about taxation without representation? Let's talk about what we tax. What about taxing furniture building? Or what about taxing, pottery? No, they didn't tax whiskey. They weren't asked, right? So there was a lot of reaction to it. Let me just talk a little bit about whiskey production and moonshining, as we call it. It's never been illegal to make liquor in America. It's illegal to make it and not pay tax on it. That's what's illegal. Barney Google and Snuffy Smith are fighting the revenues, the Internal Revenue Service. That's what the problem is. Okay, so you have a field of 3 acres of corn, and you harvest the corn. And how are you going to get that corn to market? You can pile it into 8 or 10 wagons. What if it rains in the way and the corn gets moldy and you lose your whole crop? Or you could distill it, have 1 wagon, and make more money than you'd make in those 8 or 10 wagons because you have something of value-added product. I mean, it's simple economics. Mountain people aren't dumb, We're going, okay, I can make more money if I distill my liquor and get it to market that way than if I try to take the rye or the barley or the grain or whatever it is I'm making and try to get it over the mountain and get it to market. So they're just doing what they need to do to support their families. It's not that they want to get drunk and be behind still and hide out in the mountains. That's a myth that's been created by the outsiders. Moonshining is a really good economic plan because you can get that grain and that barley to market so much easier. But now here's Washington putting a tax on it, and they weren't even asked. So there's a lot of uprising, particularly in western Pennsylvania, which is also still Appalachia. It gets kind of violent. Washington sends some peace officers, negotiators first, but then he personally leads 13,000 militiamen to western Pennsylvania to quell this rebellion. And it ends up being there's no violence. 20 men are arrested, but they're eventually set free, and it's settled without any violence. And it's one of the things that people really it begins to unify America because they say, hey, Washington could do this without violence. He did get 13,000 militiamen behind him, but that's a pretty strong statement. But at least it does become the beginning of it. Also becomes the Whiskey Rebellion is the beginning of our political promise. The Federalists felt that Washington, the state, and the federal government should be able to evenly tax the entire population. The Republicans felt that each state should decide on taxes. That's the basis, the difference between Republicans and Democrats today. It's not abortion and transgender and all these other issues. Those are smokescreens. The issue is who's going to control the money. That's what America's about, right? Do we control on the state level? Do we control on the federal level? That's the difference between the two parties. And actually, in 1801, when Jefferson's Republican Party takes over, they repeal that federal tax. That's what's good. So again, I think the very essence of America is defined by Appalachia. Who we are as people grows out of the differences, the conflicts here in this very small part of the world. So anyway, we are continuing on through, and you're also attentive. You can ask questions. So I'll give you questions at the end. I'll just go. All right. So make sure I got my stuff on here. So people begin to settle into Appalachia. But we are still very remote. We don't have roads. We literally have 3 roads to the whole state. One of them is the middle trip. That was one of the roads to the southern part of the state. But what starts to happen even before the Civil War, Appalachia starts getting designated as a strange place among strange people. Where is this? There was a man named Will Henry Harney, a journalist, that identified, and it said that Appalachia was out of step with a rapidly industrializing nation. Think about this. The gold rush is the 1850s, right? The Oregon Trail, the gold rush. They don't go through Washington, they go around. Mountains are too difficult to traverse. There's no roads. They take the Ohio River, or they go down through the Cumberland Gap, and they don't even come through here, just brought here. They really make a difference to our communities. And really change Appalachia in many, many ways. And then, of course, after the war is over, the other thing as well is just like the first war, the winners get the spoils. If you have fought for the North, you get to be postmaster. You get to have the survey job, right? You get a tract of land, right? So, and then the southern people get more and more disenfranchised, and that energy starts to really fight among each other. And so after, and the South, you go to Alabama, you go to Mississippi, they were all Southerners. You go up to Massachusetts, they were all Northerners. But here, you have people coming back to towns like Ansted and Beckley and Fayetteville. Half of them were Southerners, half of them were Northerners. There's all kinds of really negative energy, really violent outbreaks in small communities because of the war hanging on.
And it still lingers today.
Yeah, it does still linger
It
today.
still lingers today.
Which is crazy.
It's crazy.
So,
But it does.
and here's a really good example of one. We all know about the Hatfields and McCoys feud. But many people say it's because of a pig or because of a Romeo and Juliet story, but it was not. Actually, what it was, both Randall McCoy and Devil Anse Hatfield both fought for the South. But Randall McCoy was captured and put in a Union prison. And Devil Anse went, I'm done with this. And he came home and started farming again. And when Randall came back, McCoy, he was so angry that his buddy had deserted him that they started this little feud. Also, McCoy's wanted to lumber and timber, and Devil Anse wanted to stay agrarian. So again, the battle is over. Are we going to be agrarian or are we going to be industrial? That's what, and you have these fights. The Civil War brings out so many more negative fights between people that, as Darlene said, linger on and linger on and linger on. And so Appalachia is really defined by the Civil War, not because of battles, but because of these other things as well. And so that, and then the other thing, we have such fiercely resistant people. We have some people who are so strongly opinionated that you don't back down. An Appalachian person does not back down, right?
That's a nice way of putting it.
So I think I'm going to leave it open for questions now, but I do want to end with one other little quote. It's not about the war, but I just love this quote. Let's see if I can find it. This is from, when we talk about who Appalachia is. This is from a book called Missing May, who's written by Cynthia Ryland. She's a children's writer from Beckley, actually. And she talks about going to see when she saw the Capitol for the first time. And I think this defines Appalachian people in a different way than I just did. And then there it was. And I knew it was better than all three of us figured it'd be. The Capitol building sprawled gray concrete like a regal queen, spreading out her petticoats, and its giant dome glittered pure gold in the morning sun. I felt in me an embarrassing sense of pride that she was ours, that we weren't just shut down old coal mines and people on welfare like the rest of the country wanted to believe we were. We were this majestic, elegant thing, sitting solid, sparkling in the light. That's Appalachia to me. Now, some questions for me.
Did you know that Andrew Jackson's wife's mother's buried?
I do know that, yes, of course. I didn't talk about that name, Stonewall Jackson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he and I actually, I guess I should have mentioned Stonewall in terms of, because he was a significant figure for. He was really unique. He grew up poor, and he went with the South because he revered Robert E. Lee. And again, this is the issue: do you fight for the state or do you fight for the Union? This is but he was such a different man. He when he married, he was gifted some slaves, and so but he didn't believe in slavery. He was going to set them free, but he knew he could set them free without educating them. So he taught them to read and write, set them free, bought more slaves, taught them to read and write, set them free. And so that's pretty strange for a Southern general, I think. Yeah. What's that? I'm going to do coal next month.
Yeah.
I'm going to coal mine next month. Yeah.
Oh, my, no more cold. That's an end.
Really, if people would just stop and think for a moment that the Civil War was basically fought over politics.
It was.
And that's exactly why we have not progressed. That's why people are still so passionate about whether they think you're a Democrat or Republican. We haven't really advanced past what caused the Civil War. We really haven't. I mean, because people are too passionate about it.
It comes down to two things. It comes down to politics and who controls the money.
Yep.
That's what it comes down to. And that's what we fight over and have fought over and will fight over, I think. And Appalachia is just a microcosm of the rest of the country. Yeah. So other comments or questions or Appalachia plays in 70s?
So it was quite a while.
They were certainly in the East. It was in the East. east, and they were out west. I mean, they, again, they kind of everything bypasses
But
West
for a
Virginia.
long time, that was the only reliable way to get through West Virginia, was the railroad.
Yeah, I would say
With the
it wasn't
Duncan
until
Hotel
late
and-
1800s, because the first railroads were the lumber roads, and they were the narrow gauge, and then they came in and they added one more rail to make the regular
Right.
size, and it was moving lumber. You can't have coal without lumber,
Right.
so you move the lumber, you move the coal, and then you start to move people. But
So there was actually quite a bit of time between the railroads and the first roads.
yes,
Carol,
okay.
what was the defining factor that caused us to break away from Virginia and stay in the Union?
Well, the defining factor for us to call it there were, and again, in southern West Virginia, you don't hear this. There were approximately 40,000 troops fought for the Union and 10,000 troops fought for the Confederate in West Virginia. I mean, that's just, so if you think that their families all supported, whatever, really 2/3 of West Virginians did not support Virginia and breaking off. And I don't have slaves. What am I doing? This is not my fight. I don't want to be part of this. I want to stay part of the Union. I want the Union, the benefits of being part of the Union. And so there was a significant number of people. Fayette County's not their way. I'm just saying. Judge Hatcher, Judge Garvin, cornered me in a corner at a party one time years ago and said there's one person in this county that was a Union supporter, and we kept him locked in a box. But anyway, but for the most part, West Virginians were more loyal to the Union than they were to the Confederacy. Now, then you have Mercer County, where there were more soldiers in the Confederacy from Mercer County than any other county in the South, because there were so few populations in the South. So Mercer County was very strong. So southern West Virginia was very strongly pro-Confederate, but most of West Virginia wasn't. And so
along with that, moved up north, by the politicians of that time, reestablishing a lot of those things that happened up in Wheeling and that area.
well Wheeling was a
Basically,
hotbed. Charleston was too. Charleston was a hotbed for Union support.
and a lot of that's how it.
Yeah, right. Because then again, once we establish ourselves as a state, 3 times the capital moved from Wheeling to Charleston. They would sneak in the middle of the night and they'd go get all the books and they'd take them down to Charleston, and then somebody else would come in and sneak and get them from Charleston and take them back to Wheeling, and then went back to Charleston. So because there was a real fight over where should the capital should be. But most of the pro-Union people were certainly up in that Wheeling area. I mean, Pittsburgh and all. So there was certainly a lot of fight of where the capital would be and all. But for the most part, there was a really strong number of Union supporters who said, we don't have slaves. This is not okay. And there were slaves. I mean, there were slaves in Charleston in the salt mines. One of my professors, they opened an old salt mine, and when they opened it, I don't know how it was the door or what it was, there in the dust was the print of a shackle, of a foot shackle, and then the wind came through. But they had been mined by slaves. And so the sad thing was they were all rented slaves, which just like, they would go to Virginia and let slaves come up and mine salt.
I was reading, well, I just finished it, but one of the books that one of the guys that was doing here in Ansted, I guess, she heard his niece. Anyway, and the Brad guy, and Amy, we get on the road. One of the mayors in Ansted had 11 slaves.
Yeah. So, and of course, then who was the guy who contentment, who was the general in Bowdoin, he had slaves. So so there were slaves certainly in Fayette County.
Oh, absolutely, because Jim Knapp Hill, the old farmhouse that sits off to the right of Piggly Wiggly, that's one of the original farms, one of the original buildings. I have documents that came out of a safe in that house that shows tax tickets on slaves and mules, and the mules were worth more than, they were taxed at a higher rate than the people were. The mules were like $1.25 a year, and the slaves were like 75 cents.
Yeah.
That's
So there were lots of reasons, but again, it was again, there were people who didn't agree with it. And there were people, Mercer County wanted to secede from West Virginia and go back to Virginia. One other interesting thing is on the books there was of America. There's a rule that a state can't become a state until its mother state says yes, you can. We celebrate our birthday as 1863, right? But Virginia, when Virginia was allowed back after Reconstruction into the Union, it finally agreed in 1867. that we could be a state. So legally, we didn't become a state until 67, even though we celebrate 63, because Virginia, but what happened after Lincoln is killed, a few of the senators are so angry at the South. They just really are punitive. And they're like, we don't care what the law is. Virginia, you're gone. We're taking West Virginia and whatever. But we know that Lincoln Reconstruction was going to be fairly kind because they occupied Louisiana pretty early on, and we saw how he reconstructed Louisiana. It was because he was killed that the northern senators and congressmen just really got angry and put these really heavy punitive laws on the South to punish them for Lincoln's death. And of course, how did that work out for the poor African?
There's a lot of West Virginians that don't realize that we were majority Union.
No, I would agree with you.
They think of us as a southern state.
I agree with you. But I would tell you, 40,000 troops fought for the Union, 10,000 fought for the Confederacy.
Was there a dividing line geographically in the state where it was
I don't think
Union?
geographically, but I would think the southern point, I mean, you go up to Preston County, there's a Union soldier statue in front of the courthouse in Preston County.
Fayette County, was it considered a southern county? Or?
Fayette County was very southern.
Okay.
Yeah, it was controlled by the Confederacy first, and the Union came in and had this big battle. And
I know they had some redoubts and places where they were stationed here, and it was Confederate troops that were stationed.
Well, early on, okay, so at least for Fayetteville, the first battle of Fayetteville, the Union troops were out of Beckwith Road, and the Confederates were in town. And then the Union won that battle, and they took over the hill where the funeral home is now, and the Confederates were out of town. So, of course, this is where indirect firing was created. Some people say maybe not. It's where Notes brothers, who were from Ansted, invented this repeating rifle, this repeating gun, and they made a mistake of telling their friend Gatlin about it. And Gatlin was a doctor, and he just wanted the war to be over. He thought the North had a better chance of winning, so he gave the Gatlin gun to the North. And the Woods brothers fought for years to get their patent approved, and they died, and then the patent was found that they had actually done it. We don't call it the Woods gun; we call it the Gatlin gun. I don't know what Angel Face Martin would have used out of it. Here's my Woods gun. No, Southern West Virginia is strongly Union, but the rest of West Virginia wasn't. I mean, Northern West Virginia, the Eastern Panhandle. You're talking about, and that's where the bulk of the population was: Charleston, Parkersburg, Martinsburg. The Huntington.
North and South was divided by just how many of the places were burned down in Fayette County and all counties.
But again, part of that is those marauders, those deserters too, as well. I mean, they really came in and did a lot of damage. Well, I want to say thank you all so very much. You were so attentive. It was very fun to talk to you. Thank you very much.